Hollywood's golden age was a world of glamour, power, and unforgettable stars. But behind the polished image, some of its brightest names made decisions so baffling you'd think they were trying to sabotage themselves. They turned down legendary roles, wasted fortunes, clung to images that eventually destroyed them, or simply never realized how unprepared they were for fame. By the end, you'll see why talent and beauty weren't always enough to survive the ruthless machine of Hollywood. Johnny Weissmuller, the Jungle King who got lost in the city. Before Hollywood discovered him, Johnny Weissmuller was already a legend. He was an Olympic swimmer, a 5-time gold medalist who shattered records in the pool. MGM cast him as Tarzan in 1932, and his primal jungle yell became one of the most famous sounds in cinema history. But there was one problem. Johnny couldn't act. Studio insiders joked that he could swing on a vine better than he could deliver a line. He struggled with reading scripts, forgot dialogue constantly, and often defaulted to grunts or improvised nonsense. Directors simply rewrote scenes to remove words, relying on his physicality instead. Off-screen, his judgment wasn't much better. He invested in failed hotels and even tried to launch a Tarzan-themed restaurant chain. His love life was equally reckless. Married 5 times, he once proposed to a woman after meeting her in a nightclub the night before. By the 1960s, his fortune was gone. He lived out his last years in a Las Vegas hotel, wandering the halls in his robe, still introducing himself as Tarzan. Weissmuller became immortal on screen, but in real life, he was a man who never realized just how far out of his depth he was. Ed Wood, the dreamer who never woke up. Few names in Hollywood are as infamous as Edward D. Wood, Jr. He wanted to be remembered as a genius director, but instead became known as the worst filmmaker of all time. His 1959 Disaster Plan 9 from Outer Space is legendary for all the wrong reasons. Flying saucers were paper plates dangling from strings. Scenes jumped in and out of focus. And when Bela Lugosi died during filming, Wood replaced him with a taller stand-in who covered his face with a cape. Colleagues said Wood thought every script he wrote was pure Shakespeare. He filmed scenes without checking focus, ignored continuity, and filled his movies with illogical dialogue. To him, his failures weren't failures. They were misunderstood art. But Hollywood wasn't fooled. By the 1970s, Wood was broke, living in cheap motels, writing screenplays no one wanted, and drinking heavily. He died in 1978, penniless and forgotten. Only decades later did cult fans rediscover him. Ed Wood wasn't just a bad filmmaker. He was a man who never realized he lacked the tools for the empire he believed he ruled. Jayne Mansfield, the smartest dumb blonde in Hollywood. Jayne Mansfield wasn't actually dumb. In fact, she was brilliant. With an IQ reportedly higher than Einstein's, she spoke 5 languages and played the violin. But her career was built on playing Hollywood's most outrageous blonde bombshell. She leaned into the image so hard that even studio heads began to believe she was a parody. Champagne-filled bathtubs, staged wardrobe accidents, and one-liners designed to shock the press, Mansfield turned every appearance into a tabloid frenzy. But behind the glamour, her choices sabotaged her. She rejected serious acting offers if they didn't guarantee publicity. Instead, she pursued projects like Promises, Promises, a film remembered only for its nudity and scandal, not her acting. Her private life spiraled too. Marriages collapsed, court battles raged, and she surrounded herself with bizarre publicity stunts and questionable figures, including Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan. By the 1960s, she was reduced to low-budget European films. Her tragic death in 1967 locked her image in time, not as the genius she was, but as the woman who leaned so far into playing dumb that she couldn't escape it. Wallace Beery, the brute with no depth. Wallace Beery was one of MGM's biggest stars in the 1930s, even winning an Oscar for The Champ. On screen, his gruff charm made him unforgettable. But insiders knew he wasn't a great actor. He was simply loud, big, and forceful. Beery memorized lines phonetically, often without understanding them. Directors rewrote his roles to remove emotional depth or complexity. Joan Crawford despised working with him, calling him cruel and arrogant. Child actor Jackie Cooper recalled being pinched and bullied by Beery just to force tears during scenes. His business sense was equally laughable. He poured money into ostrich farms and novelty candy shops, convinced they'd be the next big thing. Politically, he dismissed serious topics, once saying, "I ain't got time for them kind of thinking." Beery's career endured because he made money at the box office, not because of talent or intellect. His story showed how brute force can sometimes be mistaken for charisma. George Raft, the gangster who said no to stardom. George Raft had everything: good looks, natural swagger, and real-life gangster ties that gave his roles authenticity. For a time, he was even bigger than Humphrey Bogart. But Raft became infamous for making the worst career choices in Hollywood history. He turned down The Maltese Falcon, the very role that made Bogart a star. He refused Casablanca, dismissing it as a weird little war picture. And he rejected Double Indemnity because he didn't like the moral ambiguity. Off-screen, he spent his time gambling with mobsters like Bugsy Siegel and Frank Costello, burning through money. Studio executives grew frustrated, describing him as stubborn and short-sighted. By the 1960s, Raft was reduced to cameos and second-rate films while Bogart's legend only grew. His downfall wasn't about scandal. It was about everything he chose not to do. Buster Crabbe, the hero who never evolved. Buster Crabbe was the ultimate Saturday matinee hero. He played Tarzan, Flash Gordon, and Buck Rogers, becoming America's favorite action man. But behind the muscles, Buster never saw acting as more than a stunt. He admitted he rarely read scripts and constantly bungled lines. Directors had to dub his dialogue in post-production. When offered serious roles, he refused, insisting audiences only wanted him as a hero. His investments were no better. He sank money into backyard swimming pool franchises that collapsed under lawsuits. Even when offered a chance to revive Flash Gordon for television, he demanded creative control, then abandoned the project. Buster Crabbe didn't fall dramatically. He just faded, trapped in a loop of repeating the same roles, never realizing Hollywood had already moved on. Esther Williams, the mermaid who sank on dry land. Esther Williams, known as Hollywood's $1 Million Mermaid, brought synchronized swimming to the big screen. Her aquatic musicals in the 1940s and 50s dazzled audiences. But Esther had little interest in acting outside the pool. She admitted she rarely read scripts, joking that if it didn't involve water, she wasn't interested. Directors had to design movies entirely around her stunts. Her personal decisions mirrored her indifference. She gave up career control to domineering husbands, dismissed television as beneath her, and launched a swimwear line that collapsed from poor management. By the late 1960s, Williams was financially insecure and largely forgotten by Hollywood. Without reinvention, her career dried up as quickly as MGM's water tanks. Milton Berle, the king who became a relic. In the 1950s, Milton Berle was Mr. Television. His show, Texaco Star Theater, was watched by nearly every household in America. But Berle's refusal to change turned him from pioneer to relic. He was notorious for stealing old jokes, recycling routines that were already decades out of date. Writers complained he ignored their scripts, firing anyone who challenged him. When executives pushed for updates, he scoffed, saying, "This is what made me famous." Off-screen, his business ventures failed just as badly. He turned down film contracts, afraid they'd hurt his nightclub gigs. He opened a chain of comedy clubs under his name but never visited them, and they all went bankrupt. By the 1960s, audiences found him outdated and unfunny. Burley's story showed how quickly you can go from king of comedy to the punchline. Frank Fay, the man who burned every bridge. Frank Fay was once considered one of America's greatest stage comedians. His timing and presence in the 1920s were unmatched. But arrogance and cruelty ended his career. He mocked colleagues, rewrote scripts without permission, and openly insulted directors. George Burns described him as the funniest man alive and the most detestable human being I ever met. Fay's offstage life was even worse. He was an open racist and anti-Semite, drank heavily during Prohibition, and was arrested multiple times. His marriage to Barbara Stanwyck ended in accusations of abuse. When sound films arrived, Fay dismissed them as beneath him. By the time he finally acted in one, critics destroyed his wooden performance. Within a decade, he was unemployable, reduced to performing in dingy clubs. Frank Fay wasn't undone by scandal or bad luck. He destroyed himself by believing his applause made him untouchable. William Frawley, Fred Mertz and his meltdowns. William Frawley is remembered as Fred Mertz from I Love Lucy. But behind the lovable neighbor was a volatile, hard-drinking man who nearly cost himself the role. For years, Frawley was blacklisted for his alcoholism. Directors refused to work with him after too many slurred takes and missed cues. Even Lucille Ball opposed his casting, but Desi Arnaz convinced her, under the condition that Frawley remain sober on set. He did, but only on set. Off-camera, he was notorious for bar fights and abrasive behavior. He dismissed rehearsals, sneering, "If you need to practice, you shouldn't be in this business." After Lucy, producers hesitated to hire him, fearing old habits. He coasted on one great role but never escaped his reputation. Jean Arthur, the star who ran away from stardom. Jean Arthur was one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, with her husky voice and charm lighting up classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But fame terrified her. Arthur suffered from crippling anxiety. She avoided interviews, rejected publicity, and sometimes vanished between films. On set, she demanded special accommodations, even insisting that entire crews leave while she filmed. Her fear of fame led her to reject legendary roles, including It's a Wonderful Life and His Girl Friday. By the mid-1940s, she walked away from Hollywood altogether, despite still being in demand. Arthur didn't fall from grace because she lacked talent. She faded because she couldn't live with the spotlight that made her famous. Rod Steiger, the actor who couldn't compromise. Rod Steiger was one of Hollywood's most intense performers, winning an Oscar for In the Heat of the Night. But his extreme devotion to method acting made him nearly impossible to work with. On set, he refused rehearsals, insisting he had to live the part, delaying shoots for hours. Co-stars described him as exhausting, and directors dreaded his outbursts. Steiger also turned down legendary roles. He rejected Patton and The Godfather, dismissing them as too simplistic or commercial. Both roles won Oscars for other actors. By the 1970s, his reputation for being difficult left him with fewer opportunities. His later years were spent in low-budget films, his talent trapped by his refusal to compromise. Peter Lorre, the genius who didn't believe in himself. Peter Lorre had one of the most memorable faces in cinema. He terrified audiences in M and the Maltese Falcon. Intelligent, witty, and trained in theater, He could have been much more than a character actor. But Laurie didn't believe in himself. Terrified of unemployment, he accepted endless typecast villain roles. When offered more mainstream opportunities, he turned them down, convinced audiences wouldn't accept him. A morphine addiction drained his finances, and he often signed contracts for far less than he was worth. At one point, he even borrowed money from Boris Karloff to avoid eviction. Laura wasn't foolish. He was brilliant, but fear of failure locked him into the shadows, keeping him from achieving the legacy he deserved. Marlene Dietrich, the queen who played dumb. Marlene Dietrich was one of Hollywood's most captivating stars. But her success wasn't just about beauty. It was about strategy. She often pretended to be less intelligent than she really was, playing into male expectations. She claimed not to understand English during contract negotiations, though she was fluent. She let directors control every detail of her image, presenting herself as passive. In reality, her private letters revealed a razor-sharp mind. Men are frightened of smart women, she admitted. But this strategy backfired. Unlike contemporaries who reinvented themselves, Dietrich had no fallback when the studio system collapsed. She survived as a singer on tour, but her Hollywood career had already dried up. Dietrich wasn't dumb. She simply hid her brilliance for so long that she limited her own future. Tony Curtis, the face without focus. Tony Curtis rose from poverty in New York to Hollywood stardom, captivating audiences in Some Like It Hot. But despite his charm, Curtis was often shallow in his approach. He admitted he rarely read scripts fully, and directors complained they had to pull performances out of him. He passed on roles that could have elevated him, choosing instead flashy projects that highlighted his looks. In interviews, his careless remarks became infamous, once referring to Laurence Olivier as that English guy who yells a lot. His personal life was just as impulsive, with 6 marriages and endless affairs. Curtis had charisma in spades, but he lacked the focus and discipline to turn stardom into legacy. Guy Madison, the poster boy who never tried. Guy Madison was discovered while working as a telephone lineman, his chiseled looks enough to land him a contract. Almost overnight, he was a teen heartthrob, but critics described him as wooden, with the personality of a bookshelf. He needed endless takes just to deliver basic lines. He showed little ambition, content to coast on his appearance. His financial choices were equally foolish. He bought a Wyoming ranch with no plan to run it, and it quickly failed. By the 1960s, he was stuck in low-budget European westerns dubbed into English. Guy Madison had every opportunity, but no drive to use it. Hollywood's golden age gave us legends, but legends aren't perfect. Johnny Weissmuller forgot his lines. Ed Wood lived in delusion. Jane Mansfield weaponized stupidity until it consumed her. Wallace Beery bullied his way through scripts he couldn't understand. George Raft turned down the very roles that made others immortal. Some stars self-destructed out of arrogance, others out of fear, and some simply refused to change. Fame made them unforgettable, but foolishness kept them from true greatness. In the end, Hollywood proved a timeless lesson. Talent and beauty can make you a star, but wisdom, humility, and adaptability are what keep you there.